Okay, now we move on to Dr. Axel. I hope you're back with us. Okay. Yes, Dr. Axel. Yes, you are here. Hi, you're back. Hi. Yes, yes, absolutely. We can hear you.
Good. I will share my screen and get my slides up and running. A moment, please.
Yes, please, please, yeah. We need to build on what we heard and see what's happening in Africa. What can we do in Africa? Poor Africans who are not developing, who are not emitting, the emissions of CO2 are minimal, and yet they are suffering. And then when there is a system to deal with the carbon credit, they are not getting compensated, for God's sakes. Okay, we need to bridge that gap. Very important.
Yeah, definitely. One moment. I'm just getting the screen up. Good. I hope you can see it.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect.
Just let's have, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So my topic is now on Africa, and of course, Fenella has beautifully described the working of Article 6 and given specific examples. And of course, Africa, has a long history in carbon markets. Carbon markets have been around now for more than 20 years. And of course, under the Kyoto Protocol, we had the Clean Development Mechanism, which was available to generate emission credits for the use by industrialized countries under the Kyoto Protocol. And that was very much driven by the European Emission Trading Scheme, where these credits could be used. And most people think that Africa was completely sidelined under this market. And if you look at certain parameters, that is true. For example, the issuance of the credits under the CDM, there Africa has less than 3%. So 3% of the credits globally in the market. Also, when one looks in the number of the projects under the Clean Development Mechanism, it's comparable. I think it's 2.8%, a bit less. But then, of course, we have seen further developments of the international carbon markets. For example, from 2010, 2011 onwards, there came the so-called programs of activities. So you could bundle many activities. And for Africa, that was a big breakthrough. So under these programs, African share is 18%. And if one looks at the issuance of credits of those programs, there the share is even 30%. So one sees Africa is not the laggard, as many people think, but Africa has started to play a significant role in the international carbon markets. And if one looks now into those activities under the CDM that can transition credits into the Article 6 mechanism, there also Africa is better than the average of the CDM. About 8.5% of the credits that can be transitioned come from Africa. So yeah, I think we need to really understand this myth of Africa having been sidelined in the carbon market. That is not true. And if one now, of course, gets into Africa in the context of the Article 6 markets, one can say that Africa is even better positioned than I've just shown with regards to the programs of activities. Of course, this catching up did not happen automatically. African actors did a lot. For example, they pushed that the rules under the CDM would be reformed so that Africa can have better access. For example, the monitoring requirements became less cumbersome. You could standardize the baseline setting. Fenella has talked about baselines. So there was a lot of work done by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat to make the CDM more accessible. One can also say that in Africa now we have a number of consultancies and project developers that are really having a very interesting portfolio. I just give one example. There is a company called Sequest Capital. It's focused on cook stoves, efficient cook stoves. It now has a portfolio in Southern Africa that has almost 50 million credits. And they are having contracts now with the big oil company, Shell and others, for almost $500 million. So that is really leading globally. And also in Egypt, we've seen a number of very interesting projects in the industrial sector, for example, in the context of nitric acid production, large projects in the cement sector. And we see now in sub-Saharan Africa really a lot of replication of, for example, these distributed household devices, cook stoves, but also water filters, biogas plants, and so on. So Africa is now a significant player on the market. And of course, we have all the forestry related activities, the so-called REDD+, where again, the sub-Saharan Africa is very active. Of course, Egypt not, that's clear, naturally, there's no forest in Egypt, but yeah. One should also say that the African governments have become very engaged to build institutional capacities. And they have, for example, formed so-called alliances. There's a West African Alliance and an East African Alliance for carbon markets and climate finance, where government representatives meet, exchange, and we at Perspectives are supporting these alliances. And we are always impressed by the level of engagement. When I was working on CDM 15 years ago, Africa was indeed lagging, but now this has changed. And one also needs to say that the private sector Africa has taken up the opportunity to really invest in such activities. And what is now really important is that we have, after Glasgow, clarity on the multilateral rules. We don't yet have fully predictable market demand under Article 6, but I hope that this comes up in the next 1-2 years. And of course, that can really be very relevant for African involvement in not only the carbon markets, but also in the Paris Agreement more generally. Now, how can carbon markets help African countries? Of course, the first element is the generation of revenue streams. Fenella has described you how this works, so I don't have to duplicate Fenella's presentation here. What is very important is that most African countries in their NDCs have conditional targets. That means the targets are conditional on international support. Now, of course, international carbon markets provide such support through their revenue streams. So one can use Article 6 to reach conditional targets of the NDCs. Of course, there are some countries that also have unconditional targets. There, the international carbon markets can help to raise the ambition of the NDC as a whole. Then the carbon markets are a very nice tool of innovation. We, for example, seen in the forest sector. 15-20 years ago, you went into the forest, you measured tree trunks. Now you have remote sensing. You can digitally monitor, for example, cook stoves. They have a chip, and this chip then provides information to a central database regarding the use of the cook stove. So we've really seen huge innovation there in the last decade, and it is continuing. Of course, Africa needs to ensure that the CDM transition is actually being undertaken, especially for the programmatic approaches, that those that have started under the CDM can now continue to expand under Article 6. That's very important for the upscaling, and I mentioned sequestered capital and the big cook stove activities in Southern Africa. One important aspect that one needs to understand, especially as a government, that of course, and Fenella mentioned it, you need to have the double bookkeeping, the corresponding adjustment. That is mandatory for Article 6, but also, of course, it will become a mark of quality in the carbon markets. And then, of course, one important aspect is now the carbon markets can help to push host country priorities. The international climate finance is less flexible because the donors, they actually have their targets, whereas the carbon markets, carbon finance, you can, as a government, direct into those areas where you really want to have a change. And of course, carbon markets usually, they are generating direct revenues. Climate finance often takes the form of loans, and then it generates risks for the country. The debt burden increases. So here I have my famous graph on the coordination of carbon markets and climate finance, the blending. So usually would look, of course, into the mitigation as per the mitigation cost. You may have certain options that are actually profitable. Those are not attractive for carbon markets because they will not pass the additionality test. So those usually would be unilaterally financed within the country. Then you have the cheap options that are having costs that are lower than the international credit price on the carbon markets. Those are attractive for the Article 6.2 and 6.4. And then, of course, you will always have a gamut of mitigation options that is more costly than the price on the international carbon markets. And there it would be important in the future now to integrate carbon market financing and climate finance. So you can combine the revenue from the carbon markets with some grant funding through either, for example, Green Climate Fund and or bilateral sources. Unfortunately, in the past, the climate finance institutions always wanted to have an iron curtain between climate finance and carbon markets. But this is currently changing, and I would hope that in the next couple of years, we see more and more of that blending. In this map, you see now the actual piloting that is happening under Article 6. It shows that Africa really is very much engaged. If one would have set up such a map for the first years of the CDM, Africa would have been a white spot. No longer so. One can really say that all the piloting activities for Article 6, the key buyers like Switzerland, like Sweden, like Japan, they are strongly engaged in African countries. And actually, one can say African countries are frontrunners. For example, Ghana. Ghana now has a coordination agreement with Switzerland. And under that agreement, it is now setting up its national Article 6 structure. I think it's the most far advanced structure in the world. And so we now see that Africa actually is a front runner in Article 6 and not a laggard as it was in the early years of the CDM. And again, of course, these alliances, I already mentioned them, they are key tools in spreading the awareness and the information on Article 6 and making African countries to have even more frontrunners. With regard to Article 6 readiness that you need to have on a government level, but of course also involving other stakeholders, it's very important that there are the three targeted areas. So first, that you first have a policy, an Article 6 strategy, which is actually vetted by all the countries' stakeholders and institutions. You need a designated national authority that is able to authorize the activities and authorize the ITMOs. Of course, this needs to be underpinned by a specific framework, legal and technical. And I think the Ghana example is very nice because that's very elaborate there. And then there needs to be some infrastructure, hardware. You need to follow, of course, the development of the activities. You need to understand where the credits are. There will, of course, be some centralized registries operated by the FCCC, but that may still take some time. And of course, what is crucial is that all this is brought together and that the different stakeholders are involved. Because if you have the beautiful strategy, but you don't have an epistemic community of consultancies, of project developers, of auditors that can actually undertake work for Article 6, then it doesn't really make sense. That would be a white elephant. And we don't want white elephants under Article 6. So here I bring 6 key points with regard to capacity building for Article 6 that have been developed under a UK initiative called Project Catalyst in the context of COP26. And I think this is generally important. And of course, I would hope that the activities that are undertaken in Africa follow these approaches. So of course, first you need awareness regarding the benefits, and that these benefits don't accrue just to a small group, but that they accrue to a a wide range of stakeholders. You need to have the inclusive institutional framework for participation. You need to have a pragmatic learning by doing approach, not just workshops. I remember 20 years ago when the CDM came up, there was a flurry of workshops, but there were only very few concrete activities. Now with Article 6, we are getting better. We are learning by doing, and Fenella has described some approaches run by GGI, but there are others. And then, of course, we need broadly accessible knowledge products, and that's where the alliances now are getting really active. In the West and East African Alliance, we have a broad range of knowledge products where Perspective supported their content, and these are now being used, and they already generate benefits. And that, of course, the capacity building is not run in many different silos by different donors and technical providers, but that this is coordinated and we get a comprehensive toolbox. So to conclude, what should be the key African priorities for COP27 in Egypt? So we still have negotiations regarding important aspects of Article 6, like reporting, like review processes, also under Article 6.4, the methodologies. We hope that the Egyptian presidency and also the African countries, the African group, can help to get these high integrity rules completed. Then, of course, we have many least developed countries and some small island developing states in Africa. It is clear that there will be some exceptions from certain rules for those states. And we need to see how these exceptions can be framed in order to prevent that LDC and SIDS-based activities are not seen as bad quality, but that they are not undergoing too cumbersome rules. For example, standardization of baselines is an important aspect here, standardization of additionality determination, and also the issue of suppressed demand, because suppressed demand, which means that you can take into account also if activities increase overall. For example, a certain service increases, so overall emissions may not go down very much, but the emission intensity goes down strongly, and you get credited for the reduction of the emissions intensity. So that essentially is the suppressed demand issue, and this runs against many other principles now specified under Article 6. So we need to see how to deal with this properly, that it doesn't destroy, let's say, the market credibility, but that it, of course, takes into account the situation of the LDCs. Then eligibility of REDD+, this is still being debated in the context of Article 6.4. Then also we have various highly technical issues regarding accounting approaches, but these are important because if they are too complicated, they may be difficult to be applied by African countries. Then this issue of the exclusion of banking from one NDC period to the next. Then also the issue of the timing of the authorization of ITMOs. The current rules give various time points, and some of those may be too late for the market to be credible. And then, of course, again, linked to nature-based solution, technical issues related to removals, especially that the rules say we need to prevent reversals in full, but we know this cannot be done technically. So we need to have pragmatic approaches that are still credible. So with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I know you are not going to plan, you're not planning not to continue with us because you have to run to another meeting. You're very, very high demand and very busy man. But I have two very quick questions for you. If you could tell us a little bit more about the Ghana National Article 6 structure, because it seems to be something unique that can be replicated by other African countries. This is my first question. And the second one, do you see any potential? Everything that we're talking about is about having involvement of Africa in the carbon market to benefit from the opportunities. But we are still not saying anything about this business of compensating the ones who are doing a lot of emissions for the poor, from the rich to the poor, from the developed countries to the less developing countries, especially the African one. Even within Africa, South Africa, you mentioned, is a key player. South Africa is the richest in the entire continent. You mentioned South Africa and you mentioned Egypt. In between the two, you have a lot of poor countries, landlocked ones, that are simply suffering from the negative effect. Any ideas on how to bring this into at least the beginning of discussions within COP27, in addition to what you mentioned? If you may say a couple of things about those two questions, we'd appreciate it very much.
Well, on Ghana, of course, Ghana has been now very elaborate on the institutional processes and the cycle a submission has to go through. For example, they require some pre-validation and check of the activity. They also, they will collect a tax of 1% of the emission credits to cater for their own NDC. And of course, they have now specified exactly who is responsible for, let's say, the check of the documentation. So I think that the draft is lying in front of cabinet and should be approved shortly, and then of course will be made publicly available. It is not yet really there for everyone to actually look at, but it's extremely elaborate. And I think, the countries, of course, need to see whether such an elaborate blueprint makes sense. Actually, what we did in the West African Alliance, we provided elements for a blueprint that takes into account the nature of different types of countries, small ones, poor ones, larger ones, richer ones. So that is actually publicly available. You find it on the website of the West African Alliance, and I would recommend you to have a look at it. With regard to the COP, of course, Africa, as you rightly said, is very diverse. What is clear is that the big players like South Africa and Egypt, they should not have any problem in getting the Article 6 infrastructure up and running. But where the real need lies in terms of capacity building is sub-Saharan Africa. These are the countries in which we actually have tried to engage with, and where we see good movement. And of course, there I would hope that it is possible that, UNFCCC, the regional collaboration centers for Africa, and also the donors come together to actually engage in a specific capacity building program. I will, in 3 days from now, participate in a conference in Japan that is planning to set up an Article 6 capacity building implementation program. And I'm hopeful that after that meeting, we see more clearer.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Now we move on to Dr. Samir Amous.
Thank you. I wish you good continuation. Bye.
Okay, we'll send you, we'll chase you with more questions if there are more from the participants. I'll reach you and I'll make sure I get the answers, okay?
Thank you, bye.
Count on this. Bye-bye now. Dr. Samir.
Yes, okay. Hello.
Hi. What can we do? What can we do to benefit?
Hopefully
Africa? Go ahead, please.
So do you have my screen now?
Yes, it is there.
Okay. So thank you first of all, for giving me this opportunity to present my experience on getting involved in carbon markets in the future. And I had the chance to start working on mitigation assessment since the beginning of the 90s. So I'm an old intervener in this market, and I also had the chance and the opportunity to get involved in developing, getting involved in carbon markets since the beginning of 2000, and through development of projects like CDM project between 2004 and 2012, intervening in several countries, Tunisia, Cameroon, and so. And my intention here is to present, based on carbon market operation models as very well described by my colleagues, the previous speaker, you will notice in my presentation, though we didn't speak together before, that we are speaking the same language. Considering that carbon markets provide new development opportunities, it is an important point because it's not a constraint. Getting involved in carbon markets could represent an excellent new development opportunity for those countries that would like to get involved in this market. And then we may imagine relevant national readiness responses to get involved in this market, and agenda that I suggest to articulate around 5 steps. The necessary knowledge on GHG mitigation potential is an important step to know how to get into the market by any country who wanted to be part of the market. Second step, establishing the institutional and organizational framework to get appropriately involved in the market, setting the rules and regulations for getting involved in this market. Of course, building awareness, expertise, and know-how in a country so that the country will be able to develop projects and then enhance its contribution or participation in the market. And then the 5th step would be promoting the country at international level. Of course, if you don't have the ability to communicate at international level, no interested buyer would come to the country to buy certified emission reduction. So how to build the necessary knowledge on GHG mitigation potential in a given country, in African country? So first of all, we know that normally as a part of NDC, biennial reports, and national communication, maybe you have already a GHG picture provided by GHG inventory, where we identify sources of GHG emission and carbon sequestration. That gives you a first picture of what would be the potential for mitigation, emission mitigation. Then the second picture is provided by the mitigation assessment that you are, as a country, supposed to develop in your submission to UNFCCC, where you evaluate mitigation potential by 2030, and possibly for those countries which already developed their low transition strategy for long term. This mitigation assessment would include several, I would say, steps. Developing GHG business as usual scenario, which corresponds to the scenario where the country would do nothing regarding mitigation. Second point, GHG mitigation scenario, which would reflect carbon transition in a given country, where you would find first national objective, which is mentioned in your NDC, which most probably correspond to what is called unconditional objective. And then second, conditional objectives which correspond to the objective of the country that would be achieved based on the fact that the country would benefit from international finance dedicated to carbon mitigation or whatever. Then in developing mitigation assessment, we also would have 2 approaches, top-down versus bottom-up approaches. Some countries would be able to develop top-down all the approaches, and others would be able to develop also bottom-up approaches. Mitigation assessment would be or could be, depending on the situation of the country, be developed in a refined way by program and projects, which would facilitate the understanding on how the country would get into the existing markets. If you have also the chance to have developed more refined studies, for example, building mitigation portfolio, this is, for instance, for the example of Tunisia, where we have already developing several mitigation portfolio. These portfolio are generally based on program or project-based that are supposed to be additional to NDC unconditional objectives. Otherwise, we can't imagine this project to get access to the markets. We would have in this mitigation portfolio also the first assessment of eligibility according to the market criteria, including Article 6.2 and 6.4, and maybe also to voluntary market, as explained by Finelas. We would have also possibly a first evaluation of the financial impacts of the carbon market for the country. And this will enhance awareness of stakeholders in the country to get interested in the market or not. So building an understanding, a good understanding of what is a market, just very rapidly, what are we talking about? What are the markets? So we are talking about, hopefully, international markets. The first market is getting into Article 6 upcoming market. Fernanda has described a little bit how the market is developing, both markets, Article 6 and voluntary. For a country, it corresponds to selling certified emission reduction to boost GHG mitigation projects in a host country. That means in developing country, in African countries. We need to specify that this mitigation potential should go beyond NDC national objective. So it should be additional to national objective, knowing that adjustment would be necessary to get accepted in the international carbon market. The second side of the market relates to voluntary market, which has three options for a country. A country could establish a voluntary market, eventually using international labels like gold standards, that operates within the national boundaries. So this, the implementation of such market would contribute to NDC objective and eventually enhance ambitions. Second option, sending emission reduction to international voluntary market. And then the third option would be that a national enterprise that would buy emission reductions from other countries to fit its voluntary compensation need, because you would find in many countries that some companies would like to compensate the emission for neutrality purposes, and if the framework is not yet in place in the country, they would need to go at international level to buy emission reductions. So these are the two options of getting into a carbon market in potential African country interested in getting into the carbon market. So getting back to the Article 6 market, what are the organizational framework and institutional framework that is needed to promote the development of access to the Article 6 market? First of all, there is a need for a country to establish a national designated authority. This authority would have the responsibility in approving, authorizing national project to get into Article 6 and 6.2 and 6.4 market. Otherwise, no buyer would come to the country to buy certified emission reduction. Also, the responsibility of national designated authority would be to evaluate projects according to sustainable development criteria and their contribution to national priorities. Then the DNA would be able to avoid those projects that are not part of the national priorities, and to avoid any, I would say, difficulties in convincing national stakeholders that this is an opportunity and not a constraint for the country. Important point also in terms of organizational step is to design an Article 6 guidebooks. So stakeholder would know how to get into the market in the country through the procedures, providing the procedure, clarifying the rules, etc. it is also important to involve major stakeholders, including private sector. For example, in Tunisia, 2/3 of the mitigation potential over the period 2021-2030 are provided by private sector, would be provided by private sector projects. So it might be a different situation on other countries, but we generally think that all mitigation potential are related to public project, but it's not really true. So it is also important to implement a national registry where we would register emission reduction that are sold to international markets, for instance, and then we would find the same registered project in those countries or enterprises at international level that would have both this certified emission reduction in order to avoid double accounting of these emission reductions. We also have in the voluntary market, if a country is interested in developing a voluntary market, in establishing a committee or an operational bureau in charge of promoting voluntary market, eventually covering the three options that I've been mentioning earlier in this PowerPoint. Also, there is a need to implement a national compensation neutrality label or build partnership with international voluntary labels so that enterprises that are willing to get into neutrality objectives wouldn't use the neutrality as without any rules and communicating on this in a strong way an unfair way. Also, there is a need to involve major stakeholders, including the private sector and NGOs, in this voluntary market development, and prepare and publish a voluntary market guidebook so all actors in the country would know how to develop and to tap on this voluntary market potential. Now, we would need also to set the rules and the regulation to get into the market. So there is a need for the country to design the relevant rules, allowing project proponents to be eligible to Article 6. For example, criteria that will allow project to be eligible, non-objection rules, out of unconditional objective, because as I mentioned earlier, it is important that those projects that are going to be, which certified emission reduction are going to be sold at international level, should be out of unconditional objectives of the country, which would contribute to the national objective. So we need to have projects that go beyond the national objectives. The rules would be necessary to allow project proponent to sell certified emission reduction, because you may have some project that the country would keep and preserve for their own purposes. So there is a need for a project proponent to know what are the certified emission reduction that are open for sale to international level. Also, procedure to Article 6 transaction, buying, selling, whatever, preserving emission reduction in the country or whatever. There is also a need to set the rules for and clarifying responsibilities related to project development, monitoring, and emission reduction certification. Who is going to be responsible for all this? Project proponent, authorities, technical consultant, whatever. So this should be also clarified. Regarding the rules, there is also important to put in place rules that clarify certified emission reduction ownership and put eventual ECES deduction from the authorities. It is an important point to give the visibility to the project proponent and to the buyer, international buyer, to know what is the ownership of ECES and what is the intervention of authorities in these ECES. Also, maybe eventual incentive to develop project under Article 6 in the country, so that they would promote the development of project. if also there is a need to know the rules regarding eventual tax provision related to income from the sale of emission reduction, because a project proponent selling emission reduction would increase its revenue. That means taxation would be higher for this project. Is the intention of the country to get these emission reduction sales taxed or not, depending on what is the objective of the authorities? And also, important point, what are the rules to adjusting national emission? Once you decide to get into the Article 6 market, there is a need to adjust a national emission, and there is a need to know how to make this adjustment nationally. How to build awareness and get communication at international level on the I would say the disposition of a country to get into the market. First of all, there is a need to implement an awareness raising program showing the carbon market potential and its possible contribution to sustainable, not possible, its contribution to sustainable development. It is very important to technological access and finance mobilization. It is a very important factor to really get actors seriously involved in developing projects. Also, there is a need to implement a capacity development program, building and update project portfolio, identify relevant projects so that they will be ready for further development as requested by international buyer. Then build national expertise. This is a very important point to be independent while developing projects from international expertise. So build national expertise, skills to develop project, conduct technical transaction, validation, registration, verification and certification, and monitoring. This is a very complex process, but being complex doesn't mean that it's not possible to do it in the African country. We could do it even provided with partnership at international level, but we are able to do it, and there is a need to build competences at African level to go ahead with developing carbon market projects. Building also negotiating skills, because beyond generating emission reduction, then you would have to sell your emission reductions, and there is a need to know how to negotiate the prices, the quantities, etc. You also need to build national and international partnership, because as soon as you have partnership with the potential buyer, with international organization, will be better placed to really get benefit of the opportunities at international level. Last point, promoting the national destination as an important, as a relevant destination for emission reduction buyer. So we need to develop and implement a communication program showing that the mitigation item potential of the country is interesting, that the country is ready institutionally in terms of existing rules, in terms of project portfolio availability, in terms of technical capacity in the countries. So the country is ready to act very rapidly to satisfy potential coming demand. So the effective launching of project development, so it is important also to go ahead very rapidly into the market by developing projects and showing that projects are successfully developed and there is an international presence in the country that are interested in buying certificates in emission reduction. There is also an important point that shows the seriousness of environmental integrity of all the projects that are suggested, proposed, and implemented in the country, providing the existence of a registry, of adjustment rule, etc., so that it gives credibility of the country destination to international carbon markets. There is also a need to link with NDC and enhancement of ambition, and these should be mentioned in the updated NDC and the biennial report showing that market development in the country are an integral part of the NDC and of transition in carbon emissions of the country. So last point, develop a dynamic website, of course, linking easily national and international actors, including Article 6 and voluntary markets. Also, this website would show transparently the smooth development of activities in the country, and then facilitate and attract future buyer in the market or future operators in the market in general. Also, the country could also organize carbon events and forum. So it showed it positions the country at international level in the markets and participate to measure international carbon events and forums. So the country is present in these international events, and this would provide for more possibility to sign with international buyer and operator. So thanks a lot for your attention. I hope that it was clear enough to understand the opportunities for African country to get into the market. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. That was extremely helpful, and it's a very relaxed and detailed and easy to capture guide on how to make countries benefit from the opportunities in Africa. So I really thank you for that. But what especially on the institutional and organizational framework and the awareness, etc., and all of it seems to be focused on having a mature government, actually, one that is sophisticated and developed enough to be able to allow that. All of this is, again, requires a government that is giving a lot of room for activity, and this raises the question mark: to what extent are the African governments ready or with the level of sophistication needed in order to benefit from that? But this is an excellent, actually, guideline. And you mentioned that the private sector plays a key role. Speaking of the private sector, so thank you very much, Dr. Samir, and please stay with us because there will be questions at the end.